The following is a Life is Strange 2 theory which explores the story of Captain Spirit and relies heavily on information from all 4 of the main endings. As such, there will be major plot spoilers ahead. You've been warned. The morning of the 16th of April 2020 was like any other, a sunny Thursday morning with highs of 68 degrees Fahrenheit. On this sunny morning, 13-year-old Chris Eriksen of 114 Evergreen Street took the bus to school as he did every morning.
Milk mission accomplished.
After a breakfast of eggs on toast, Chris rushed to get his homework done on the bus, as he often did. He took his pew next to his best friend and closest confidant, Daniel Diaz.
I'll go with you guys.
Really? Yeah!
A boy of the same age, but with a monumental secret that the boys shared together. Each morning, it was the same. Daniel would help Chris with his English homework, while Chris would help Daniel with math. The two shared answers for their classes, and they made sure they both had completed sheets by the time they were at school. But this morning was different. For a while now, the potholes that had plagued the thin, winding streets of the surrounding area of Beaver Creek. Generally, Slow Susan, as Daniel called their bus driver, was careful and attentive, but in Susan's absence, a substitute driver filled the role. An old man, lackadaisical and ignorant, took the wheel, and things did not go well. Daniel and Chris had instantly noticed the front wheel dipping into a pothole halfway through their journey, flicking their eyes up from menial sums and Shakespeare quotes, and watched as the bus veered from side to side, swerving dangerously. Daniel had felt this before, the speed, intensity and fear of death in an automobile. He tightened his wrist, bending the forces of the air with his mind to create a shield in front of their bus. Despite the certainty of the bus toppling into the cliffside into the shallow lake, it veered on its front wheels before leaning backwards into the curve of the road and stopping. They were safe. Chris and Daniel left the bus, and school was cancelled for the day. The boys came home, feigning trauma and sickness, and best taking advantage of Daniel's doting grandmother for an extra helping of cake and sweets, playing video games into the evening. But what if Daniel wasn't there? What if he was, let's say, in Mexico? And that's where our theory begins. Hello everybody, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Serrated Cucumber, and today we're going to be going over my theory of the tragic fate of Chris Eriksen. Is he doomed to die in the low morality endings, and why? I'll go through the criteria that need to be met for Chris to have died on the bus in the low morality endings. That's my overall theory on the matter. We begin with the start of the story, the bus accident. Proof is given of Daniel using his powers for good in the redemption and parting ways endings, in order to show Daniel honouring his promise to Sean, to be smart, and to use his powers for good, which he'd made at the border years earlier. It's heartwarming, and gives the player the sense of pride that they'd raised their little brother well, with strong moral sensibilities and heroic duties. For all the pain and suffering that had been on his shoulders, he'd managed to use his powers for good still. But this is all completely reversed once we consider what would have happened if Daniel was not there, instead on a beach somewhere in Mexico, whether with or without his brother, robbing a bank, getting a tattoo, fixing cars, whatever he was doing, he was certainly not anywhere near a school in Beaver Creek in Oregon. We can establish that without Daniel's intervention, this tragedy would have taken place. But for him using his powers, or as the newspaper article puts it, a miracle, this definitely would have transpired, as it would have in the low morality endings where Daniel is not in Beaver Creek. I also think the use of the word tragedy is significant to this story. They haven't used the word accident or crash or anything low level. They've used the word tragedy specifically, a word with connotations of death. Typical tragedies throughout media result in death. It's a word Dontnod writers are likely familiar with through their study of media in relation to Life is Strange 2, and isn't just a term they've thrown in. It has meaning, and it's a very specific word. How often is tragedy used in the news when it's not discussing death-related issues? It's not really. Go and watch any news channel, the stories related to tragedies almost always involve death. The next thing we must establish is to see if we can link up the details of my story to the details in game. Was Chris Eriksen on this bus? It's very likely. In what case would Daniel be on a school bus where Chris isn't? Chris lives on what seems like the outskirts of Beaver Creek on a lonely little road. His only neighbours he mentions knowing are the Reynolds. He and Daniel live next door to one another despite the 12-house difference in address for some reason. The likelihood is that Daniel and Chris would be on the bus together heading to school when the event takes place, and thus he was able to save it using his powers. At least in the parting ways and redemption endings. So, we clarify that but for Daniel saving the bus, it would have resulted in a tragedy, as the game itself specifies. Chris was also likely on this bus. So then, does this mean that Chris's death is an unavoidable part of the low morality endings? Not necessarily, though I do believe it's highly likely. The first point of contention is that Chris may not have actually been on the bus at all, and this is evidenced by the fact that Daniel is actually drawn to be outside of the bus in Sean's comic in Redemption, meaning the two may not have actually been on the bus together. But Sean would have likely heard about this through word of mouth or from newspaper photos after the event. He could have just drawn it the way he imagined it, right? Not to mention that as a teenager at the time, if Daniel was not on a bus going to school, he would have been skipping as well as Chris, something I don't see either of the boys doing in the high morality endings. They're not the type to do it. Daniel and Chris specifically are good kids. So we reach a sort of conclusion of my short theory. Is Chris Eriksen dead? Well, we've established that if Daniel wasn't there, this tragedy mentioned in the Redemption and Parting Ways endings would have taken place, in the other endings too. We don't get any information about the damage to the school bus, however the word tragedy invokes connotations of death, leading us to believe that without Daniel's intervention, people would have died on the bus. Given that Daniel saved it, it's likely that this bus would have picked both Daniel and Chris up from their homes in Beaver Creek, meaning that without Daniel, it would have picked Chris up anyway, just on his own. So, riding on his own on the bus, Chris would have been involved in the accident, and the likelihood is, Chris would have died on the bus, the exact same way as his mother, Emily, without Daniel's help. In a car accident. It's actually kind of a running theme throughout Life is Strange that parents will die the same way as their children will. Esteban was shot, and subsequently Sean was too. William was originally hit by a car, and so was Chloe in the alternate timeline. Emily was killed in a car accident, and so is it really so far-fetched to suggest that Chris could also be? However, bear in mind that Don't Not have confirmed that this is our story to tell. You don't have to accept my theory as gospel, and I know this will bring a lot of people grief, so it's okay to accept that in your reality, maybe Chris was skipping school on that day, maybe he was sick with a fever, maybe it didn't happen at all because maybe the bus crashing was in some way Daniel's fault to begin with. You can headcanon it however you choose to, but that's just a theory, a Life is Strange theory. Hope you guys enjoyed this short video. I do have some plans for some upcoming content in the near future, so stay tuned for that. I know this video was very different from my normal ones, and I'm sorry if it comes off as perhaps a little stunted or compromises on quality due to its length. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to join our Life is Strange 2 Discord server, which I'll link in the description below, and follow me on Twitter. But as always, remember to keep your cucumbers serrated and have a nice day. If you can, after regretting your Blood Brothers playthrough. Adios! Chris would have been involved in the accident, and the likelihood is, Chris would have died the same way as... I hate myself.